Thank you, Dean Richardson. It is such an honor to be here. And thank you to all of you, and thank you to the incredible musicians. I know all of you have a wonderful experience, but you have no idea what it's like to be listening to them from behind, sort of coming over your head. This is an unforgettable musical and spiritual experience. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you. I'm aware what a venerable tradition is involved in this particular speaker series, and I'm so grateful to have the honor of being here. And Dean Richardson, I understand what you mean when you were talking about your son reading my book, and as I mentioned to you earlier, our kids don't get it from us, none of us. When my daughter was growing up and started quoting Deepak Chopra to me, quoting Wayne Dyer to me, "You know, Mommy, Wayne Dyer said," I said, "He did he?" So we all know that. There's something about you're not going to get it from your parents, no matter who you are. When I was growing up, my father was an immigration lawyer. He was a great warrior for social justice. And when I began to speak about spiritual matters, and I was becoming very comfortable on the pulpit, I was becoming very comfortable as someone who was speaking in that sacred space, that sacred Sabbath space, of spiritual and religious matters. At one point, my father said to me, "What happened to you? I raised you to fight the system." And I said to my father, "Daddy, I am. Love is the greatest revolutionary force. Love is the greatest revolutionary force." And he understood that. But I also have come to understand over a long career that there are phases in life. There are phases in one person's life, and there are phases in the life of a nation. I believe strongly in the power of the Sabbath. I believe strongly in the power of religious and spiritual worship because it transforms hearts. I have felt for a long time the clergy is someone who holds aloft in the consciousness of the people the conscience of a nation, hovering just above mortal events, close enough to speak about them, but hovering just high enough to be able to give a larger perspective. But then those of us who are on the pulpit also go through the phases of our own lives. And I'm not the first person who has recognized that there are moments when you need to go from the pulpit to the streets. And there are times when you have to go from the streets to the voting booth. And as I have come to understand, there are times you need to go from the voting booth onto the ballot. I have always known that even on the pulpit, you must keep politics in mind. As Mahatma Gandhi said, anybody who thinks religion doesn't have anything to do with politics doesn't understand religion. I know not only that on the pulpit you must keep politics in mind, but I also know that in politics you must keep spirit and love and God in mind. Because the two are interlaced intimately. And the reason they are interlaced intimately is because both speak to the purpose of our lives, and that is to the eradication of human suffering. Whether that human suffering is symbolized by the crucifixion of Jesus, whether it is symbolized by the suffering of the Israelites as slaves in Egypt, whether it is symbolized by Buddha speaking of all life as suffering until that suffering is cast out from compassion. You can't skip the crucifixion and go right to the resurrection. You can't skip the slavery and go right to the promised land. You can't skip the suffering and go right to compassion. That's not transcendence, that's denial. And just as it is the purpose of our lives to be conduits of love for that express purpose to help eradicate the suffering of all sentient beings, so we must remember that our collective behavior is simply the expression of that same impulse within the human heart. And that's all that politics is. Politics is simply our collective behavior. Politics comes from the root politeia, it means of the people. So if as individuals we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be good? If as individuals we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be loving? If as individuals we ask ourselves, am I doing the right thing? Am I being forgiving? Am I being compassionate? Must I give up my judgments here? What is judgment? What is discernment? What is the path before me that love would have me walk? We must ask that question not only as individuals, we must ask it as a nation. We must ask it as a nation, you cannot be great if you're not good. And every citizen of this country is like an immune cell. Every citizen must ask that for our country. And it is to the detriment of our country when people, particularly in the name of spirituality, which could only be the most counterfeit form of spirituality, think that somehow our religious or our spiritual path justifies looking away from human suffering. There is, in fact, there is, in fact, no religious or spiritual tradition that has ever existed that gives any of us a pass, from looking straight into human suffering and our task to eradicate it in whatever way possible. In the history of the United States, it's important to remember the role that the great religious and spiritual traditions have played in the path of social justice. Abolition didn't arise from people within our government saying, let's eradicate slavery. No, it did not. It arose from the early evangelicals and Quakers. It was the people rising up, people of conscience who rose up. They stepped in, and then the path of the government was to follow. And in the women's suffragette movement, many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. The whole notion that there is an inner light within every man, woman, and child, which is the great equalizer. You must do more than believe that. You must stand on that mount. You must stand on that rock. If, in fact, all of us are equal in God's eyes, and if, in fact, our task on this earth is to make it on earth as it is in heaven, then slavery must not exist. Oppression of women must not exist. White nationalism must not exist. Segregation must not exist. Mass incarceration must not exist. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing must not exist. 13 million children in the richest country in the world must not exist. 100,000 homeless children must not exist. Economic injustice must not exist. The abdication of all moral leadership in this world on the part of the United States must not exist. The desecration of the earth must not exist. All undemocratic forces must not exist. And it is the task of those of heart. It is the task of those of conscience. It is the task of the religious and the spiritual seeker to stand up at times, as the abolitionists did, as the women suffragettes did, and as the civil rights workers did, not following but leading and making clear that shall be no more. I have come to understand in my life, I've begun, I feel, to have some insight into the difference between those who were anti-slavery and those who were abolitionists. Those who were anti-slavery did not agree with slave owning. They did not agree with slavery. They would never have owned slaves. They thought people who did own slaves were immoral and wrong, sinful perhaps even. They would not live in slave-owning states, etc.